The first thing I saw when I pulled my truck up to my new cabin after weeks on a solo road trip was a woman standing in the middle of the driveway with her arms crossed, staring at me like I had just stolen something. I had just come back from a trip that took me across mountains, highways, and quiet little towns, where I spent my days camping under the stars and driving through long stretches of empty roads. The whole time, I kept thinking about how good it was going to feel finally settling into my new cabin, the one I worked hard for, the one I dreamed about owning for years. I expected peace, quiet, and maybe even a warm welcome from neighbors. Instead, I was greeted by hostility from a woman I didn't even know. She was planted firmly on the gravel driveway like a guard dog, chin tilted high, expression sharp. "Excuse me," she snapped, before I even had a chance to get out of the truck. Her voice had that tone you just know belongs to someone used to getting their way. "You can't park here. You're not even supposed to be here yet." I blinked, confused, my hand still on the steering wheel. "What do you mean I can't park here? This is my property." She scoffed like I just told her the sky was green. "Not in our HOA records, it isn't. I've been keeping track of who comes and goes. You're not on the list." That's when it hit me, she was one of those people. The kind who think a clipboard and a loud voice make them the ruler of everyone else. She actually pulled a stack of papers from under her arm, flipping through them dramatically like she was a courtroom lawyer about to prove me guilty of some crime. I stepped out of the truck, stretching my legs after hours of driving, and gave her a steady look. "Ma'am, I just signed the closing papers a few weeks ago. The deed has my name on it. This cabin is mine now." Her eyes narrowed, and her lips curled into a smug little smile that made me instantly tired. "Oh, I don't think so. The last owner told me I could manage things while he was gone, and I've been doing just that for years. You can't just show up here out of nowhere and act like you belong." I almost laughed. I mean, really? I'd been on the road for weeks, daydreaming about finally relaxing in my own place, and instead of putting my bags inside, I was stuck explaining ownership to a random woman with a power complex. "I'm not acting like I belong," I told her, my patience thinning. "I do belong. It's my home." But instead of listening, she spun on her heel and shouted toward a house across the street. "Call the cops. We've got a trespasser." I froze. Did she really just say that? Was she seriously about to waste police time because she couldn't admit she was wrong? The neighbor she yelled at looked hesitant, like they'd seen this performance before, but Karen, because let's be real, she was the perfect definition of a Karen, kept waving her arms like this was some kind of emergency. I rubbed my temples, feeling exhaustion sink deeper into me. Weeks on the road, running on gas station coffee and truck stop meals, all for this. Instead of kicking back on the porch, I was standing in a driveway being accused of trespassing on land I legally owned. Still, I knew blowing up at her wouldn't help. People like her thrive on drama. So I stayed calm and leaned against my truck, waiting to see what stunt she'd pull next. She kept pacing back and forth in front of the cabin, muttering about rules and violations, as if she had a handbook hidden in her purse. I glanced around, taking in the neighborhood. The cabin sat along a quiet lake road, surrounded by pine trees and the faint smell of wood smoke from someone's fireplace. It was supposed to be peaceful, a retreat from chaos. But with Karen standing there like a guard at a border crossing, it felt anything but. Minutes dragged by until I heard it, the sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder. She had actually called them. My stomach sank, not because I was guilty, but because I already knew how ridiculous this was going to look. Imagine being a cop and showing up to a trespassing call, only to find the supposed trespasser unloading suitcases from his own truck. Karen's face lit up when the police car pulled onto the road, like she had just won a battle. She straightened her posture, smoothed her shirt, and pointed at me with all the drama of someone accusing a thief in a TV show. "That's him. That's the man trying to break in. I couldn't help but laugh under my breath. This was beyond absurd. I reached into my truck, pulled out the thick folder I had prepared before leaving for my road trip, and held it at my side. I had a feeling I was going to need it sooner rather than later. When the officers stepped out, she immediately rushed toward them, her words tumbling out in rapid fire. "Officers! Thank goodness you came. This man is trying to move into that cabin, but he doesn't live here. He's trespassing. You need to remove him before he damages anything." The officers looked past her at me. I didn't look like a criminal. I looked like a guy with a tired face, a packed truck, and the paperwork to prove I belonged. They held up a hand to quiet her down, then one of them asked, "Sir, what's going on here?" I opened the folder and calmly handed over the deed. "What's going on is that I just got back from a road trip. This is my cabin. I bought it legally. Everything's in order." She doesn't seem to like that. The officer flipped through the documents, nodding slowly. His partner peered over his shoulder, then looked at Karen. "Ma'am, everything here checks out. He's the legal owner of this property." Karen's jaw dropped so fast it was almost comical. She stammered, pointing at me like her finger could prove her right. "And no, that can't be. I've been taking care of that spot for years. He can't just show up and take it away from me." The officer's voice turned firm. "Ma'am, it's not your spot to take care of anymore. You can't call the police on someone for moving into their own home. If you continue to cause problems, you could be facing charges." For a moment, she was speechless. Then, red in the face, she turned on her heel and stormed off, muttering under her breath about rules and authority. I let out a long sigh of relief, shaking the officer's hand and thanking him for his time. They gave me a sympathetic smile before heading back to their car. I finally picked up my bags and carried them inside, but even as I set them down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Karen had just lost round one, and from the way she had glared at me as she stomped away, I knew she'd be back. People like her don't let things go. She had just called the cops on me for existing. Whatever came next was bound to be worse. The next morning started off with a false sense of calm. The lake was still, the air was crisp, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I thought maybe things had settled down. The chaos of the night before seemed like it had finally blown over. I had coffee brewing inside, and I was carrying a mug out to the porch when I heard the unmistakable sound of heels clicking against gravel. I didn't even need to look to know who it was. Karen was back, and she was marching toward my porch with a stack of papers clutched in her hand like they were weapons. Before I could even greet her, she waved the papers in my face. "You're already in violation," she declared. "You haven't registered your presence with the HOA. You haven't filled out your landscaping request form. And don't think you can just repaint anything without approval." I stared at her for a long moment, sipping my coffee slowly. "Karen, I bought this cabin because it's outside HOA jurisdiction. There's no HOA here. You can't enforce rules that don't exist." Her face twitched, like she'd just swallowed something bitter. "Oh, it exists," she insisted, tapping her papers. "I've been managing this neighborhood for years. Everyone knows to come through me. If you think you're exempt, you're mistaken." I leaned against the porch railing, trying not to laugh. "You're telling me I need your permission to live in my own house?" "Exactly," she said, her voice sharp with triumph, as though she'd trapped me with my own words. I shook my head. This woman wasn't just bossy, she was delusional. The problem was, she believed her own nonsense. And worse, she was determined to make me believe it too. Over the next few days, Karen escalated. She started leaving violation notices taped to my front door. One day it was about the color of my curtains. The next day it was about the length of my grass, even though I'd only just moved in. Another time, she accused me of putting out trash cans on the wrong day, even though the nearest collection service didn't run for another week. Each notice was typed up on HOA-style letterhead she had clearly made herself, complete with an official-looking logo and a fake signature at the bottom. At first, I ignored her. I tossed the notices straight into the trash and went about my business. But she didn't like being ignored. She ramped things up by banging on my door early in the morning, sometimes as early as 6 a.m., demanding I check in with her before leaving for the day. She claimed it was part of community protocol. I told her flat out there was no protocol, no HOA, and no way I was reporting to her like she was some kind of warden. That only made her more furious. Then came the parking issue. Every time I left the cabin, I'd come back to find her big SUV parked so close to the edge of my driveway that it was nearly impossible to maneuver around. Once, she even pulled in halfway across my drive, forcing me to park my truck at an angle just to squeeze in. When I confronted her about it, she shrugged. That spot's been mine for years. The last owner never minded. You don't get to change the rules just because you feel like it. I wanted to snap at her, but I kept my cool. Karen, the last owner might not have cared, but I do. That strip of land is part of my property. I don't want you parking there. She smirked. Prove it. That night, frustrated beyond belief, I sat down with the packet of closing documents I had kept in my truck. As I combed through the property description, something caught my eye. The narrow strip of gravel Karen had claimed as her personal parking space was clearly marked within the boundaries of my land. It wasn't community property, and it certainly wasn't hers. I wanted to be absolutely sure, so the next day I drove into the county office to pull up zoning maps and land surveys. When the clerk unrolled the survey on the counter, I nearly laughed out loud. The map highlighted every inch of property I owned, and sure enough, Karen's favorite parking spot was included. She had been using my land for years without permission, simply because nobody had bothered to stop her. On the drive back to the cabin, my frustration started to transform into something else: resolve. If Karen wanted to challenge me with fake rules and loud threats, then I was going to counter with something stronger: the law. She wanted to fight dirty. I was going to fight clean but smart. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the air cooled, I sat on the porch thinking about how to handle it. I knew confronting her directly wouldn't work. She thrived on drama and yelling matches. No, I needed to do something that would shut her down completely, something she couldn't twist or argue against. The answer was obvious: I had to take back control of that spot in a way she couldn't ignore. The next morning, I called a local contractor. I explained the situation briefly, careful not to sound like some petty neighbor trying to stir trouble. All I need, I told him, is a secure post installed in the center of my property's edge to prevent unauthorized parking. And I'd like a sign put up too, something clear, legal, and impossible to miss. The contractor came out later that afternoon, his truck loaded with tools and materials. As he unloaded, a few curious neighbors peeked out from their porches, watching quietly. Karen, of course, was the first to storm over. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her hands on her hips. "You can't do construction without HOA approval." The contractor glanced at me nervously. I reassured him with a nod. "She doesn't have any authority here. Go ahead." Karen's face twisted in outrage as the contractor drilled into the gravel and secured a heavy-duty steel post right in the middle of the space. By the time he finished attaching a bright white sign with bold black letters, "Private Property, No Parking," Karen was shaking with rage. She marched right up to me, pointing a finger in my chest. "You can't do this. That's my spot. I've used it for years." I calmly pulled the deed from my folder and handed her a copy of the survey I'd gotten from the county. "It's not your spot, Karen. It's mine. And now it's officially marked as private. You can't use it anymore." She sputtered, unable to form a sentence. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked like she didn't know what to say. She stormed off toward her house, muttering threats under her breath about taking this to the board and getting me fined. But I knew the truth. There was no board, no HOA, and no fines. Just her, clinging desperately to power that didn't exist. As the contractor drove off and the neighbors retreated into their homes, I stood by the new post and sign, feeling a wave of relief. For the first time since moving in, I felt like I had taken back control of my property. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't going to give up that easily. She had already called the cops once, and she'd probably try again. The difference now was, I had proof, paperwork, and the law on my side. And next time she tried to challenge me, she'd find out the hard way that I wasn't someone she could push around. Karen didn't take long to strike back. By the very next morning, she was back at it, standing outside my cabin like a sentry with her phone in hand, recording me as I carried groceries inside. "Everyone's going to see what kind of neighbor you are," she said loudly enough for half the street to hear. "Blocking people from using community property, harassing women, and breaking rules left and right." Her voice had that smug confidence again, the kind that comes from believing if you repeat a lie enough times, it'll magically become true. I ignored her at first, but she wasn't one to be ignored. When I went to grab another bag from my truck, I found a brand new notice taped to the driver's side window. It looked like all the others, fake HOA letterhead, made-up violations, and this time, a fine of $500 for illegal property modification. I tore it off, crumpled it up, and stuffed it into my pocket without even reading the rest. But inside, I was boiling. She had no authority, no power, and yet she was bold enough to write fake fines as if she could actually collect. The part that really got to me wasn't the notice itself, it was the way she smiled when she saw me take it down, like she thought she was still in control. That's when I decided enough was enough. I wasn't just going to protect my spot. I was going to shut her down for good. The first step was documenting everything. I spent the next few days taking photos of every fake notice she left, every time her SUV crept too close to my property, every attempt she made to record me without my consent. I even installed a couple of security cameras on the corners of my cabin, angled perfectly to capture her antics. The funny thing? The moment she saw those cameras, she exploded. "You can't film me," she shouted from the street, shaking her fist at the lens. "It's a violation of HOA privacy rules." I laughed so hard I almost dropped my screwdriver. "Karen, you keep forgetting. There is no HOA here. And this is my property. If you don't want to be on camera, stay off my land." The look on her face was priceless, but instead of backing down, she doubled her efforts. That evening, she parked her SUV across the street and sat there with the engine running, staring at my cabin like she was waiting for me to make a wrong move. It was harassment, plain and simple, but I didn't call the cops. Not yet. I wanted her to dig her own hole deeper. A couple of days later, I got the perfect chance. I was sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee, enjoying the morning breeze, when I heard shouting. It wasn't aimed at me this time, it was coming from Karen's yard. She was yelling at a teenage boy on a bike, accusing him of riding too close to her mailbox. "That's an HOA violation," she barked. The poor kid looked terrified, pedaling off as fast as he could. The neighbors across the street shook their heads, whispering to each other, clearly tired of her behavior. That's when it clicked. Karen wasn't just targeting me. She had been terrorizing the whole neighborhood for years. The difference was, I wasn't afraid of her. And maybe, just maybe, if I stood my ground hard enough, the others would see they didn't have to put up with her either. Later that week, I decided to take things one step further. Since I owned that parking strip legally, I figured why stop at a single post and a sign? I called the contractor back and had him install a chain barrier with a lock across the entrance to the spot. It wasn't just about blocking her anymore. It was about making a statement, this was my land, and she couldn't touch it. When she came out and saw the chain, her reaction was even better than I imagined. Her face went from shock to fury in seconds. "This is harassment," she screeched, pulling out her phone. "You can't block my vehicle from parking there. I've used this spot longer than you've even lived here." I walked over calmly, holding up the county survey I'd been keeping on hand. "Karen, this isn't harassment. This is me exercising my rights as the property owner. The county records back me up. You've been parking on land that doesn't belong to you. That ends now." She jabbed her finger at me like she was casting a spell. "I'll call the cops again. Just you wait." "Go ahead," I said with a shrug. "Last time you did, it didn't work out so well for you. Want to try your luck again?" She froze, her face turning red as a tomato, then spun on her heel and stormed back to her house, slamming the door so hard it rattled the porch across the street. I thought that might finally be the end of it, but I underestimated her stubbornness. 2 days later, sure enough, the cops rolled up again. Same officers as before. They looked tired the moment they stepped out of the cruiser. Karen came rushing out of her house like a contestant on a game show, pointing at the chain and screaming about illegal structures and endangering the community. The officer sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Ma'am, we told you before. This man owns the property. He can put up posts, chains, signs, whatever he wants, as long as it's within his land boundaries." "But it's community property," she wailed. The officer held up the survey I'd given him. "No, ma'am, it's not. It's his. You've been parking there without permission for years. If you keep this up, you could be facing charges for harassment and false police reports." The silence that followed was golden. For the first time, Karen had no one to back her up, no bluff left to play. The officers gave me a nod and drove off, leaving her standing in her driveway like a deflated balloon. That moment was a turning point. The neighbors, who had been watching quietly from the sidelines, finally started approaching me. One by one, they told me stories about Karen's nonsense, fines for leaving their trash cans out too long, threats for painting their shutters without her approval, even yelling at kids for playing too loudly. She had been ruling the block through fear and fake authority, but now they saw she wasn't untouchable. I didn't realize it at the time, but by standing up to her, I had lit a spark. The neighborhood was waking up, and Karen's little empire was crumbling. As for me, I finally started to relax again. I'd sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the lake, listening to the quiet hum of crickets instead of Karen's voice. Every time I glanced at that chain and the bold private property sign, I felt a surge of satisfaction. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about peace. I had drawn the line, and she couldn't cross it. Of course, I knew Karen wasn't done for good. People like her rarely admit defeat. But the balance had shifted. The cops had sided with me twice. The neighbors were starting to see through her. And most importantly, I had the law firmly in my corner. She could rant, she could scream, she could scribble fake notices until her printer ran out of ink. None of it mattered. The more she fought, the more she exposed herself for what she really was, a bully with no power. When Karen realized her usual tricks weren't working anymore, she started trying new ones. At first, it was petty little things. She'd leave garbage bags right on the edge of my property line, claiming it was overflow trash from the community. Then she started spreading rumors to anyone who'd listen, telling neighbors I was some kind of squatter who forged paperwork to steal the cabin. But the thing about lies is that they only work if people believe them, and after seeing her antics firsthand, the neighbors weren't buying it anymore. I'd catch them glancing at me with sympathetic smiles, shaking their heads as Karen spun her wild stories. It was clear her influence was crumbling. But Karen wasn't someone who went down quietly. She had built her identity around being the self-proclaimed HOA queen of the block, and losing that control was eating her alive. So she doubled down. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the sound of pounding, so loud it shook my windows. I opened the door to find her standing there with a clipboard, sunglasses perched on her face like she was some kind of officer. "You're required to attend an HOA meeting this afternoon," she announced, handing me a flyer with bold letters across the top, "Mandatory homeowner attendance." I read it over and nearly laughed. The meeting was scheduled to take place in her living room. The agenda? Reviewing violations, discussing fines, and voting on new community rules. I handed the paper back to her. "Karen, there is no HOA. I'm not attending your fake meeting." She glared at me like I'd just insulted royalty. "If you refuse, I'll have no choice but to issue further penalties." I closed the door in her face before she could finish. Later, I watched from my porch as she set up folding chairs in her driveway, trying to lure neighbors in. Only two showed up, an elderly couple who looked too polite to say no. Even they left after 10 minutes, shaking their heads as Karen waved her arms dramatically about rule enforcement and neighborhood image. It was embarrassing to watch, and I think that humiliation only fueled her anger toward me. The final straw came a week later. I came home one afternoon to find her SUV pulled up halfway across my driveway again, blocking me from getting in. Only this time, she was standing next to it with her phone pressed to her ear. As soon as she saw me, she shouted loud enough for me to hear, "Yes, officer, he's threatening me right now. He's unstable and dangerous." That was it. She wasn't just playing HOA games anymore. She was flat out lying to the police to get me in trouble. I parked my truck on the road and turned on my phone camera, recording everything. I walked up slowly, staying calm, making sure my hands were visible. "Karen, I'm not threatening you. I'm recording this so there's proof. You're lying to the police right now." She froze for half a second, realizing she'd been caught, then hissed at me, "You'll regret this." When the officers showed up, different ones this time, I showed them the video immediately. They listened to her frantic story, then watched the footage of me calmly approaching while she accused me of being dangerous. It didn't take them long to piece things together. "Ma'am," one of the officers said firmly, "this is the third false report we've received about your neighbor. You need to understand, filing false claims is a crime. If this continues, we will have no choice but to pursue charges." Karen's face drained of color. She tried to argue, but the officers shut her down quickly. They told her she had no authority, no HOA backing her up, and no right to harass me. When they left, she stood in her driveway trembling with fury, but she didn't say a word. That moment changed everything. Word spread fast around the neighborhood that the police had warned her. The very next day, one of my neighbors, a man named Tom who lived 2 cabins down, came by with a tray of cookies his wife had baked. "We've been watching how you handled her," he said, shaking my hand. "Honestly, you did what the rest of us were too scared to do. You stood up to her. Thank you." Soon after, more neighbors started stopping by, sharing their own Karen horror stories. She had fined people for lawn decorations, yelled at kids for playing basketball, and even once threatened to tow someone's car for parking in front of their own cabin. Nobody liked her, but until now, nobody had been able to stop her. I realized I had become the unintentional hero of the block, simply by refusing to let her walk all over me. As for Karen, she kept her distance after that. Maybe it was the police warning. Maybe it was the fact that her neighbors no longer supported her little power trips. Or maybe it was the sight of that locked chain across the parking spot she had claimed for so long, a daily reminder that her reign was over. Whatever it was, she started keeping to herself, glaring at me from behind her curtains instead of storming into my yard. With Karen finally quiet, I was able to enjoy my cabin the way I had always imagined. I spent mornings on the porch sipping coffee while watching the lake shimmer in the sunlight. I worked on little projects inside, fixing up the old woodwork and adding personal touches. In the evenings, I grilled on the deck while neighbors stopped by to chat, something nobody had done before, out of fear of Karen. Slowly, the block started to feel like a real community again. One night, sitting around a fire pit with Tom and a few others, someone joked, "I think you broke Karen. She hasn't yelled at anyone in a week." We all laughed, but there was truth to it. By standing up to her, I had shown everyone she wasn't as powerful as she pretended to be. She thrived on control, but once that control was gone, she had nothing left. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a little satisfaction every time I walked past the sign and chain marking my parking spot. Not because I wanted to rub it in her face, but because it symbolized more than just a patch of gravel. It symbolized boundaries. It symbolized standing up for myself when someone tried to push me around. It symbolized the end of her fake authority. And the best part? I didn't have to get nasty or play dirty. I did it all legally, calmly, and with proof. I didn't stoop to her level. I let her bury herself with her own lies, and when the truth came out, it was undeniable. Karen still lives in the neighborhood, but she's a shadow of the person she used to be. She doesn't storm around with clipboards anymore. She doesn't tape fake fines to doors. She doesn't scream at kids for riding bikes. She walks her dog quietly, avoids eye contact, and pretends she never tried to run the block like a dictator. As for me, I finally got the peace I had been chasing when I bought the cabin. The road trip that brought me here was about finding freedom, and in a way, standing up to Karen was part of that journey. She thought she could scare me off, but all she did was push me to plant my feet even firmer. So when people ask me about the worst part of moving in, I tell them it wasn't the unpacking, or the long drive, or even the repairs. It was Karen. But when they ask me about the best part, I tell them it was winning. Not through shouting, not through revenge, but through patience, persistence, and the law. Because sometimes, the sweetest victory is proving to a bully that their power was never real to begin with.